Hi, this is the new René, revision 2. According to Modular Grid, the original René from 2009 is Eurorack's most popular sequencer. It brought to Eurorack the concept of Cartesian, or XY, or grid-based sequencing, which is a method of sequencing where, rather than going through steps sequentially, as is done in traditional sequencers, you can go back and forth, up and down, left or right, or frankly in any angle in a number of steps and in any direction on a grid of locations versus just steps. This new version of René 2, expands on this concept in multiple different ways, but probably the most striking one is that it literally goes deeper. Letting you travel in any direction, not just down, up, left, right, but also in and out in a third dimension. Now, don't worry, I know that sounds odd, I'll explain everything. There are quite a few more little tricks that have been added, but the second big thing is that you now have 3 sequencing tracks instead of just 1. For example, here, this lead is run by channel 1, the X track. The bass, which hopefully you can hear if you've got speakers or headphones, is the Y track. And then I've got a modulation track, the C track, which is affecting the sound going out to rings. In this video, I'll go over everything you need to know about what René 2 can do, and in a future video, I'll address a few advanced ideas for it, so hit subscribe to be notified about that. Or if you're from the future, there should be a link to it somewhere around here. And with that said, let's check out everything the new René can do. Okay, before we dive into the third, or Z dimension, or moving between states, let's take a look at what a basic state contains. Each state has 3 different channels: the X, or red channel, the Y, or green channel, and the C, Cartesian, or orange channel. In each channel, you can jump around between up to 16 different locations. Each location can store either quantized notes or continuous voltage levels controlled by individual knobs on the CV grid. In addition, you can control various parameters using the page grid. For example, on the access page, by default, every channel has 16 steps, but you can easily reduce that to, say, 8 or 10 or any number you want. Of the 3 channels, channels X and Y are completely independent of each other, whereas channel C is a Cartesian derivative of channels X and Y. Each of channels Y and X have their own clocks, their own modifiers, and their own control voltage inputs, whereas the clock for channel C is a combination of the X and Y clocks. Inputting actual sequence data into a channel is quite simple. You turn the knob to set its CV or note content. You can also see what note each knob position represents by going into the quant page. You can see the notes of the scale are labeled here, and I can turn them on or off, and as I move the knob, I can move between the notes. So if, for example, I wanted to sequence a simple 4-note sequence, I've got just these steps activated, and then I can go ahead into the quantize page and even set a value per note if I wanted. So I'll make this C, select this one, choose, let's say, E, select this one, G is good for me, select this one, let's go for a B. I'm programming the X channel so I can connect the gate to rings here, voltage to control the notes, and clock to get it going. So that's how you program notes in locations. Now let's get to the big differences between channels XY and C. In channels X and Y, movement across this grid is done in one of 16 different snake patterns. So if I go into the snake page, you can see the different ways that you can travel through the various locations on the grid. There are 16 snake patterns overall. The bottom 8 are relatively straightforward and simple, and then the top 8 kind of go nuts all over the place in different ways. Now I kind of randomly entered notes into this sequence, so it doesn't make much of a difference if we jumble those notes around. But it gets pretty interesting if you enter a melody you know, and then mix it up a bit. So the snake patterns are how you move between locations on the X and Y channels. You also have a few more advanced movement features using the Xmod, Ymod, and XCV and YCV inputs. These two additional inputs, the mod and CV inputs for the X and Y channel, have different functions based on how they're configured in the fun page or function page. We'll get to that in a bit. The third channel, the Cartesian channel, doesn't have any clock or mod inputs of its own at all. It also doesn't have any snake patterns, so if you go through the pages here, you can see it skips the snake option. Rather, the motion of channel C is derived from channels X and Y, and now it begins to make sense why they're called X and Y and not A or B. And that's because the active location for channel C moves left and right, or on the X-axis, based on inputs from the X channel, and up and down based on inputs from the Y channel. You can see that if I unmute the clock for channel X, this active location starts moving on the X-axis. Similarly, if I take another clock from Tempe and plug it into the Y clock, the Y-axis clock, you can see the active location starts to move on the Y-axis. And if I unmute both the X and Y clocks, you can see that the active location starts to move based on the different clock pulses from these two clocks. So with these two clocks, basically we have channel C moving, but channels X and Y haven't turned off either, right? They're still doing their thing. And if I go into here, I can see all three motions together. This is state mode. We'll talk about this in a bit, but it's a really nice way to see what's going on across all three channels. In terms of outputs, each of the three channels can output either voltage or gate, and if you want, you can disable quantization for each of the channels individually. Now, I know I've been going through the concept of pages very quickly, so let's address that for a second. So I can use these left and right arrows to page through the different control pages for every channel. Let's start with access. You'll remember initially, we were only running through these 4 steps because we enabled access only to these 4 locations. The access page determines which locations are active in a pattern. So now all 16 are active, and I can disable any of the locations I want. I'll hook rings back up so that we can hear what we're doing. Now, the fact that a location is active doesn't mean that it sends out gate. So if you want, you can disable gate outputs. And you can see how rings treats these differently. And that's basically how the gate page works. You enable or disable gates on a per location basis. Right? You hear the attack of the sound here, and the voltage changes the note without attack on the steps that don't have an active gate. So that's the gate page. Let's take a look at the glide page. Now for that, I'll create some distance, some wild distance between the different notes so that the glide between them will become more apparent. Let's get a pattern going. Then when I activate glide, you can see it's gliding on the locations where glide is active. We already talked about the snake page. It defines 16 different routes through these lights for channels X and Y, and we know there is no snake page for the Cartesian channel. And we already talked about the quantization page. Just I'll briefly say that aside from choosing the notes, which as I mentioned are labeled here, you can also choose whether quantization will happen across 1, 2, 3, or 4 octaves. And you can disable quantization altogether if you like. That leaves us with the fun or function page. So what the fun page does is let you toggle between various settings as described on the top 3 rows here. The function settings are grouped by row. So for example, the fun.mod row determines how René will treat voltage coming in through the mod input. For example, if I activate this location, then mod input will reset the sequence. This location will treat any gate coming in here just as another trigger. Run stop, you guessed it, lets the mod input decide whether the sequence runs or stops, and dir or direction will change its direction. The fun CV row does the same thing for the CV input, whether the CV input will transpose or add voltage to the sequence, whether voltage coming in here will be used to control the location. Let me show you briefly how that works. I'll take voltage from maths, plug it in here, and now I can control location using voltage, and this happens in addition to the sequence controls. Hook this up to a tempo synced envelope or LFO, and your sequence can get really interesting. So that's location. Snake will let me choose the snake pattern using voltage, and sample and hold is similar to add, but it will only change the voltage or quantize when it receives a rising edge on the XMod input. Finally, the top row addresses things that aren't related to the inputs. The sleep function determines how René treats the locations that aren't access enabled. So let's, for example, disable these. You can see that the snake pattern is skipping all the disabled locations. Right? If I go into sleep mode, they'll still be part of the pattern. René will just ignore voltage changes on those locations. There are two more options on the fun page. The trig option will replace an incoming gate with a trigger, and what scan does, besides a light show, is to load all the physical knob positions into the current channel. Normally, when you swap a pattern or page, the stored knob positions are loaded, so the physical knob positions don't represent the true values. Hitting scan loads up the actual knob positions into the current channel and overwrites the previously stored positions. The fourth row, by the way, is ignored here and is used for global functions, which we'll talk about in state mode. Finally, there's actually one more page, which is latch mode. So normally, when you go to the access page, you'll see which steps are active and which aren't. Latch mode lets you change that temporarily. You enter latch mode by re-tapping the channel button, and all the page LEDs will light up. And what happens here, it's sort of like a secondary access page. So if I activate the clock, we're still seeing this pattern, but the minute I select one location here, then we'll just get the ones that are selected on the latch page. If I deactivate them, we go back to the original pattern. So this is a nice way to have sort of like a temporary secondary access page in addition to the one that's stored. Another nice secondary use for latch mode is playing the individual locations, which is a nice way to also quickly tune them. Finally, the last nifty feature about latch mode is that it can save access locations throughout states as you move through the different dimensions or states, which is a good segue into talking about what states are. So a state is the state of the three different channels, right? So I've got channel X doing this thing and channel Y maybe doing this thing, and the Cartesian channel doing this. And of course, the individual settings as well can be configured on a per page, per channel basis, right? So all these different settings for each of the different channels, all these things are a state, one state. And you can both store and move through 64 of these. You go into state mode by tapping both the left and right arrows, and you know that you're in state mode because these little letters are breathing when you choose them. Now the function of these three controls are no longer control for the X, Y, and C channels, but rather what is labeled here, the global page, the select page, and the M-paste page. Let's start with the select page. The 64 different states are organized in 4 banks with 16 different states in each bank. You hit the Y button to toggle between choosing between the different states and choosing between the different banks. Here I've got only banks 1 and 2 active, but I can activate 3 and 4 and easily move between the different banks. You can see the color change as I move between the banks. And once I've chosen my particular bank, I hit this again and choose which state I want to activate. Now you can move between the states manually, or you can just take a clock and plug it into the ZMod input, and boom, you're moving between states just as easily as you're moving between patterns. If you hold the left button, you can disable access to states just like you disabled access to locations before. Not only that, you can also disable banks, right? So now only banks C and D will be active. Now, not for ego purposes, but rather for scientific purposes, just to show you how quickly you can move between the different states. Check this out. The animation you're seeing here is really just different glide settings for each of the different states that I'm quickly toggling through. So you can see moving through states or through the Z-axis is just as easy as moving through X and Y. Okay, so that's all there is to know about the Select page or the Y page in Global Settings. Let's talk about this tab. The Global tab or page is similar to the Fun or Function page, but only applies globally. There are 4 things you can do here. Hitting Store saves the entire state of René to memory so that it will survive shutting down and turning back on again. Doing this will pause René, so don't do this in the middle of a song. And done. The global Z on lets you modulate states anywhere and not just on the Select page. Reset chooses whether patterns will reset when you change states. The default is off, which means that states just flow from one to the other rather than start again from the beginning every time you change a state. And then finally, this activates Global Bus Lead mode, which lets Global Bus enabled modules like Tempi and Disting Mark IV change presets together, which is pretty cool because it lets you use René 2 to control presets on other modules. So for example, and I'll unplug these so that hell doesn't break loose. Once I activate Global Bus, if I change banks here, check out the bank colors on Tempi, they will change as well, and they're not connected to each other. The way this works is that the modules are communicating with each other using the Select bus inside the case. So we talked about the Y page, which lets you select banks and states. We talked about the Settings page, which lets you configure a few things globally. Let's talk about the last page, which is called the MPaste or Mesh Paste tab, which has 2 functions, to mesh and to paste. If you want to copy the current pattern to a few states, you just select the states that you want to copy to, and you can choose banks here. Let's choose this one, and let's say these states. And then a long press here causes this to sparkle and the paste to happen. The mesh function lets you choose a few states again, and then any changes that you apply going forward on the program pages, right, going in to change any one of these things, will apply to all the selected states, not just the one that's the active one. So for example, if I wanted to quantize just to these 4 semitones, this was now applied to all the active mesh states. So let's, for example, choose this pattern. Let's check its quantization, and then maybe choose this pattern. Let's check its quantization, same thing. So that's a really powerful way to edit through multiple dimensions simultaneously. So those are pretty much all the functions of René 2. So let's look at some pros and cons. In terms of pros, clearly something made the original René the most popular Eurorack sequencer. And this one improves on it in a number of important ways. The extra 2 channels, the 64 states, per step glide, and more just make this a completely different beast. In terms of cons, it's really about feature selection and alternatives. Other Eurorack sequencers have MIDI ins and outs, have polyphonic support, and more, but then on the other hand, with the risk of generalizing, they'll probably lack the flexible sequencing features of René 2. Top on my wish list would be the ability to seamlessly change states regardless of the number of steps per state. Currently, you can create patterns that are more than 16 steps long, but you need to be proactive about timing state changes to do that. Another thing I'd like to see, and I don't know if this is possible, is faster response time on the touch grid. So currently, if you swipe slowly, everything registers fine, but if you swipe too fast, you might miss a few spots. It's not that big of a deal once you get used to it, but you do need to be aware of it to avoid non-registered taps. So basically, that's what René 2 can do. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'll be making an advanced René 2 video after I get to know it a bit more, so hit subscribe and ring the little YouTube bell to be notified when that happens. Meanwhile, check out my ebook with other electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks on Patreon. Ask me any questions below. Hit like if you liked this video. Thanks very much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.